Welcome back, you've built the Exiles. So, obviously, on the 27th of March, we've got the announcement for the new 0.2.0 patch, and I thought it was time to start making some videos because the last month for me has been a bit of a lazy month, to be honest with you. And that's just because I've been traveling and whatnot. But anyway, I wanted to talk about Path of Exile 2 and some of the things that would be really nice to see come into the game and or the direction that it probably needs to take moving forwards. Considering, like, when we look at just Steam chart player numbers are drastically down from when it started. I don't expect they will go back to where they were initially until the actual 1.0 launch, which will be in quite some time based on the production cycle that they're working on now. But there's a lot of things that need to be done in the game to just get foundation right now. So I, for one, will preface that I'm excited, right? I really want Path of Exile 2 to be a fantastic game. Right now, it's just got a lot of glaring issues that need to be addressed to bring this concept called fun back into it. Now, the focus of this video is not to over-sensationalize everything. I don't, for one, think that it's a divisive topic or, like, there's a number of other words that go around the decisions for making an ARPG and all that sort of stuff. I actually think that the game should be open to everybody, whomever wants to play it, and it shouldn't be gated behind, if you don't like this concept, you can go away. Path of Exile 1 is very welcoming in that respect. Like, there are some learning curves and difficulties, but for the most, players can get into the game. Some people don't like the game, that's okay, but also the game tries to tailor as best it can, considering it's an older game now. There's some limitations, but Path of Exile 2 is a blank slate. And so it can be a game that is for absolutely everybody. Now, obviously, games like Last Epoch and whatnot do this quite successfully around build diversity and whatnot. These are some of the issues that exist that we'll talk about in this video. In particular, the lack thereof of build diversity right now for Path of Exile 2. Some of the build sort of videos that have come out to do showcases, they're great concept builds, but they're also not realistic builds. And when I say realistic, they're not builds that are going to carry you to endgame. There's a lot of jank, there's a lot of things missing, and part of this is because Path of Exile 2 is a heftily incomplete game right now as it stands. But that being said, I guess what I'm going to talk about are just grounding things that need to be fixed in the game to make it an overall better game, i.e. for me personally, one of the ones that annoys me the most about the game is the lack thereof of quality when it comes to armor. And armor just simply doesn't currently work very well, and some people may disagree with that. I've played a lot of armor characters though, and I'm pretty confident to say that armor is hot garbage right now. Anyway, let's get into the video. Let's have a talk about some of these topics. There's quite a number that we're going to work through, and I'll have some gameplays you can probably already see in the background of what I believe the game should look like. In particular, there's a few things that I really like about Path of Exile 2. Like, I like the fact that, you can play double mace builds and stuff like that, which is a really cool concept. Like, you could do that in Path of Exile 1, but in Path of Exile 2, there's a lot of capacity for that to be great. In particular, with some of the new gems or support gems that are coming into the game, I think that's a great way to turn, like, Mace Strike into this skill that can be varied to absolutely every combination. The problem with the game when playing melee skills like Mace Strike and stuff like that right now, though, is the lack of AoE unless you're using Armor Break and Armor Explode and stuff like that. So it'll be nice to see what they do in respect to that. And I really want to see swords make their way into the game as well as axes sooner than later. I know we're probably going to get spears in this next patch, but, they've sort of hinted at swords, and swords will just be a total game changer, I feel, because of the speed that comes with strike skills and whatnot. But anyway, let's get into the video and talk about some of the things that we need to run through. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is foundation and forward direction. So basically, I use the concept of foundation quite a lot when I explain getting the basics right to young accountants and finance staff and whatnot. And the concept applies here for Path of Exile 2, even though it's a video game. Some of these concepts from life apply to how the game should be approached. So what do I mean by foundation? Well, what I mean by foundation is right now, the game lacks a sense of identity, and some people may disagree with that comment, but right now I'll give you a great example, which is the parallel of difference between the campaign playstyle and speed versus the end game, which in the end game you're getting crowded, blasted, everything else, and there's a push to make zoom one shot blow whole screen up builds, i.e. Hoa builds and like Spark Archmage, mana stackers, and things like that. That to me does not make sense as like the way that the campaign plays. Like the campaign should be a slower, like the campaign is a slower pace. There are things in the campaign I don't like, and we'll talk about that later in the video. I think pacing is off and things like that. But in the essence of it, the biggest problems don't really exist in the campaign versus the actual end game. So right now, the way that I see the game is it has a Path of Exile 1 end game to a Path of Exile 2 early game. And I don't dislike the way that Path of Exile 2 plays, I might add, in the early game to mid game. I actually think the slower pace is good, and this was a problem that I didn't necessarily like so much in Path of Exile 1 either. And the pacing and like explode builds and stuff like that are pretty wild. And unpopularly, of my comment is I actually sort of think things like, you know, one button, you know, attribute stacking, Gemling Legionnaires in Path of Exile 2 need to be nerfed. And so people might disagree with that, but also bizarrely, people are also turning around and saying that they like the slower pace of Path of Exile 2, except when they get to the end game, they want that fast zoom pace. I don't understand that parallel, and so my whole idea of it is the pacing set from the very start of the game should be somewhat of a comparable pacing in the end game, which means making maps that are bigger, a little smaller, making things more consumable in the end game and more impactful and meaningful. Combat just a little more meaningful. Quite often, the things that I die to in maps, for example, are just getting mobbed by white packs as opposed to the actual boss itself in a map. And so those things are a little bizarre to me because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's probably the first thing that I'd say. Like the identity of the game needs a bit of work, and I hope this patch sort of refines and balances that out. I don't think like hectic, oh my god, crazy, oh use all the bait words under the sun changes are the approach that GGG needs to take. I think a grounded understanding of what is the game we are trying to make and what does that game look like now that we've seen the extremes on both opposite ends. What is the middle point compromise of where this game needs to go into the future? I think if they can get that right and they can set the identity of the game, it'll actually make the game a hell of a lot more fun, number one, and also set the direction, I guess, to how the player base sort of perceives the game, as well as the patches and types of skills and things like that get added into the game will look like. I just think right now it's all over the place. It's like they rushed a 6-month end game into a game they've spent 6 to 7 years developing, predominantly in the campaign. And some of the things that we see that also don't make a lot of sense, i.e., and we'll talk about it shortly, will be like the uniques as well. So a lot of the uniques are just vendor garbage. What's the point of putting a unique into a game where it's supposed to be impactful if it doesn't make any sense to run it outside of the campaign? Like a lot of the uniques just don't work outside of the campaign, outside of things like Hoa and Temporalaris and things like that. And so basically, like, it just means, like, what is the point of all those uniques? We're just doing things we did in Path of Exile 1, in Path of Exile 2, and my understanding is I thought this was a totally different game. And so, yeah, that's one of the things that I would like to see is them just refine what the game is supposed to be and what the pacing should be from, you know, start to finish. Now that they've seen where the extremes can be taken with what they've put in the game so far today. Okay, so the next thing that I want to see is Endgame getting a bit of an overhaul. Now, we already know that, for example, towers are getting changed. I'm not 100% convinced that this is the best change in the world, because what it sounds to me is they're going to make towers more frustrating. I think like they continually keep trying to adjust towers without realizing that maybe it's a concept that nobody wants and they need to take that feedback on notice. But anyway, this is just something that they need to figure out over time. I actually rather like the idle system they added in Freesia, and I wouldn't mind seeing that make its way into Path of Exile 2 in some form. I think that that could actually be really good. Now, a few of the things which I've already touched on, pacing and speed is just totally off. Like, in quite a number of circumstances, you're just getting totally mobbed by ridiculous amounts of packs and whatnot. The endgame content that they do add in, by the way, so it looks like they'll probably add in maybe Bestiary because of the nature of the 0.20 patch. But the problem with adding endgame content is the endgame needs to be in some form that makes it tenable to play. Currently, it's just not in that form. Unless you're playing like a ridiculously cracked build, a lot of the end game content's really gated and it's just not a lot of fun. And or you're getting absolutely obliterated by breaches, or like you've got rituals spawning in weird off-map locations that make no sense, which by the way doesn't happen in Path of Exile 1 commonly. So it's confusing as to why it's happening in Path of Exile 2. And it might be because they've just really willy-nilly added it into the game, and then they didn't really think about how it works with the way that the new maps generate and whatnot. So there's a lot of like mechanical problems with the actual endgame system. From what I've heard, and I haven't really played around with Simulacrum, but it's quite difficult unnecessarily. So a lot of these things just need to be addressed in the end game before they start adding more end game content into the game. Like, I really want to see Delve come into the game, for example. I love Delve. I think everyone knows that who follows the channel or has seen me around. But here's the thing, I don't think it should be in Path of Exile 2 yet, because Path of Exile 2 is just not ready for it. And in a lot of ways, it's not ready for a lot of endgame content that could be coming in. So I think Bestiary and Ina will make its way back in Path of Exile 2 in this next patch, potentially. But also at the same pace, you know, what's that going to look like? I'm not entirely sure. It is good to see changes to essences and whatnot. That's really cool. Like, we've got some screenshots and stuff like that that we've seen so far from the patch sort of teasers, and that would be in the previous video. I'll link that in the description that we covered off on all those. The other thing that I have grievances with in the end game, and this is a contentious one, is map portals. So I don't think one map portal is reasonable. Like, I think a scaled approach would be fine. You start with 3, and then when you get to like T15s, you're at like 1 or 2, something like that. But I think one death maps just is not fun. It just, to me, just seems like an over penalty. And I know the other side of the argument from players that have come from different games is the XP loss is another issue. So, like, take your pick. Either give us more map portals and we'll take the XP loss, or give us one map portal but don't take the XP away, I think is some sort of a compromise in between there. I'm actually more on the page of I would rather complete my maps than lose my maps and the potential for loot, and take a bit of XP loss knowing that I need to be gear checked, versus, you know, I lose the map and the potential for loot or the boss or whatever it might be, but then I don't lose the XP. I would rather lose the XP personally, but that's just my opinion. Don't burn me about that in the comments. Like, if you disagree with that, that's absolutely fine. Now, the other problem I've got with the end game as well is the focus on fun. I feel like the game is trying to separate itself out and just be deliberately different in a lot of ways without really thinking about the whole end game of why people play video games. So, like, it needs to be a fun and exciting sort of process as you progress through to the end game. You know, you're getting more powerful, your character's building and growing. I right now feel like, just with the lack of build diversity in the game and the lack of meaningful uniques and just some of the really off feel of how enemies and combat feels in the game and whatnot, it just doesn't really lend itself to focus around fun. And I think, like, there's probably a big market of people out there that enjoy the game for what it is right now, but it just drastically needs to change to encompass fun. Like, you know, have a look at a lot of people have sort of defected to Path of Exile 2. Now, the other reason, Path of Exile 1. Now, the other reason for that is obviously the lack of content that's been released with Path of Exile 2 up to date, which is, you know, a bit disappointing, and that's probably a video for another day to talk about production cycles. But I think like, in a way, in trying to make a really cool tech demo is what Path of Exile 2 sort of feels to me. They've sort of lost the focus on what makes a game really fun to play, and they've just made it mechanically sort of meticulous and cumbersome. And I feel like taking out some of the complexity as far as like the amount of time it takes to level a character and whatnot, and also just making things like being able to change the ascendancies in your ascendancy trials. These small things just make it a lot more fun to be able to test builds and test setups and whatnot. The other thing that I don't really like in the end game right now is the labbing system or equivalent, which is the Trials of Sekma and or the Chaos Trials. I think making essentially ascending a pinnacle boss exercise really just isn't that much fun. And also, it's supposed to be a tool that enables you to get to pinnacle bosses, and I feel like they've sort of lost the path with that. A lot of people just do not like Trials of Sekma. And the problem with Trials of Sekma is it's still better than the Trial of Chaos because Trial of Chaos is just way too punishing. So I feel like there's a lot of problems with that area in the end game too that need to be ironed out. I'm confident that they'll come up with solutions for this stuff because we haven't been seeing a lot of change. And generally with GGG, and even just in general, when we're not seeing a lot of change, it's probably because the next big patch is a drastic amount of change. And they have done that in Path of Exile 1 and also reverted changes that were too drastic and things like that. So I feel like even they're probably looking at this going, well, you know, player numbers are dropping off. Why is that happening? Yada, yada, yada. And I think all these things will probably be topics that they'll cover off on. But right now, the end game just doesn't feel very good. Like, it also lacks a lot of purpose. Once you beat the final pinnacle, it's like, well, what's the point at that stage? There's nothing to really do beyond that point. And the league content they've added in is pretty lackluster. So anyway, I hope they focus on a lot of this in this patch. Like, and this is where I'm like, they could add a lot of endgame stuff in, but I would actually rather fewer endgame additions being added in, but more focus on the existing quality of the endgame and how that fits into the total style and play feel of the actual game itself. I think is a much more important thing to focus on than just punching out content and adding more things to click on at the very end of it all. Okay, so the next big thing that they really need to put some attention into is the crafting system. So right now, essentially, the crafting system is more or less non-existent. It's totally RNG based, and crafting by nature is RNG based to a degree. But I am strongly of the belief the crafting bench needs to come back. So the omen system really does not work, and even if you can get the omen system to work, the ability to access omens currently in Path of Exile 2 is very niche and very expensive. Adding things like alterations, scarings, stuff like that from Path of Exile 1 would actually be a great outcome. Having crafting bench to be able to tackle those early problems when you're trying to balance gear again would be a great way to attack, you know, the crafting issue in the game. The reliance on drops, the reliance on buying stuff off the vendor market, I feel like in theory is one of those like in theory it was a great idea situations, but in reality, it's just trying to do Path of Exile 1 in a different way, deliberately for the sake of it being different. I actually think just putting the crafting bench in there and letting players be able to actively craft on gear if they've collected the mats and stuff like that is the best course. Like, this is one of those, they figured out this problem with the first game already scenarios, so they didn't need to fix it in any way, shape, or form because it was already in a state that was fantastic. So crafting right now is probably one of the biggest issues I've got with the game because really, like, you know, you could use the combinator thing, but that's an end game thing for when you get to crafting. Outside of that, reliance on vendors, yeah, it's really hit and miss. You just don't get enough. Like, you do get currency drop throughout the campaign, but also that's active trade currency too. So, you know, what's to stop people from just blasting the campaign, collecting divs and stuff like that in the campaign easily? That makes there to be a bit of a market imbalance to a degree as well at that point. Over reliance on the trade market isn't necessarily a great thing. It doesn't lend itself to being very conducive to a positive SSF experience. I just feel like overall they need to just add in the crafting bench and stop playing around with that. Like, it's just unnecessary at this stage, like to try and come up with a new concept for something that was unique and fantastic. Alternatively, deterministic crafting like the Forge in Last Epoch would be absolutely amazing. So this is what the problem is. Like, they're probably going to add in ROG crafting is already in the game with Expedition, right? So basically, like, yeah, you can have ROG crafting, which is expensive and hard to get to and a bit lackluster, or you could just put in a forge system like Last Epoch and have a deterministic crafting system, which, and I'll say, you know, Last Epoch's crafting system is second to none. It's amazing. It's so powerful. It gives you gear you need as you level up. It's easily accessible. It can be worked on at any point in time. There's no mucking around. You just hit the forge and you just start reforging gear based on your mats that you've collected. I feel like if they added some form of deterministic crafting in the Path of Exile 2, that would be fantastic. as sort of like a light crafting option maybe, and then you can do a more complex crafting option when you get to endgame or when you get further into like min-maxing and stuff like that, and maybe they just add the crafting bench in. I feel like in this area trying to cut stuff out and compress and whatnot wasn't necessarily the right answer. I feel like they needed to refine what they did with the crafting bench and make it, I guess, more accessible to a degree, make it simpler to a degree and easily accessible. But changing it entirely, I think, is just like, they made it in the first game. It's fantastic. Why take it out of the second game? So crafting is probably one of the biggest things I'd like to see there being a bit of change to. It could also be the case where like they've got the image of the Forge Master sort of thing. We don't know what the ascendancy is called yet, but maybe it could also be a hint to some sort of hammer and anvil system coming back in, or rune crafting benches or something of that nature. I would really like to see that come into the game. I think the socketable runes are cool to a degree, but I think like they just put the old like gem link system back into Path of Exile 2. They're just sort of like they're cannibalizing and reinventing the same concepts they've already made. And if they simply just made it a bit tighter, a bit more refined than Path of Exile 1, and a bit more targeted and impactful, then that could be a really good outcome for Path of Exile 2 to put in a crafting bench system and stuff like that again. But anyway, just my opinion on it. I just think crafting is a bit meh at the moment. In particular, like for people trying to craft gear for endgame to sell on the market and stuff like that, it's just not really tenable. It's all just gamba crafting right now, which takes away a lot of the fun for people who play that type of endgame, and those sorts of people are probably not going to come over to Path of Exile 2, which is going to put a big limiter to the amount of gear that goes onto the market as well, because for those people who min-max in that upper end, they're reliant on those master crafters to come into the game and do that sort of exercise. Okay, so the next point of discussion is a really interesting one, which we start to talk about build diversity in Path of Exile 2. So basically, this is PoE Ninja 2 or PoE2.ninja, right? I'll put a link in the description. So for the purpose of what we're going to look at today, we'll have a look at the standard league, right? So there's always like a predominant meta, okay, in Path of Exile. That's just how it works. But the one that exists here is quite problematic to a degree, especially for a new game. But it's not surprising, right? Now, I guess with the direction that we thought that Path of Exile 2 would be taking, it would be a much more like, make your own build, everything will sort of work scenario, but it hasn't actually played out like that. So what we can see is there's a pretty clear meta that exists for each type of league scenario. Actually, the most varied across the board is SSF because it's harder to get gear. Interestingly, like this is where the Acolyte of Choyula sort of is played at least 1.8%. Now, the other thing, bearing in mind, like these accounts, like this is just like a sample of accounts. We'll look at this statistically, right, as a sample of the population. So this is a good idea of the players that are sitting in that like 98 to 100 sort of space. And this will improve as the website gets more data when it becomes available to us, right? So just going in and having a look at Stormweaver, for example, what we can see up here is the item spread, and this is problematic, right? So the first thing that we notice off the cuff is like almost every build is Spark, right? There's a few that aren't, but for the most, it's Spark or Frostwall or something of that nature, right? Because like Frostwall was nerfed and whatever, people probably worked around that a bit. They're all Chaos Inoculation builds, right? Every single one of them. And they're all what appears to be mana stackers, okay? So they're all running Archmage, essentially. So, like, 96% of the gear in all of the characters that are in here is Ingenuity, because that just works the best, and that's, again, problematic. And then, like, Melting Maelstrom as well. And as we go down, we start to see the spread starts to get a little less um, Temporal Aris, considering how rare it is still used 26% of the time. But basically, like every build is basically the same, right? Depending on a few different changes here or there. But yeah, like Dream Fragment as well is used quite commonly. And yeah, Adorn stacking. If we go into the next build, this is another random one. It'll be relatively similar in nature. Yep, just not Adorn stacked, but same sort of configuration. We go down to the bottom, we pick any random build, it'll just be a less iteration of that build because it's not as developed to the 100. Basically the same setup, 2 Dream Fragments this time, and then all these other nodes down here. So This is for just the Sork ride. So again, this is problematic for Path of Exile 2, and there's a little bit of attention that needs to be sort of garnered in this area. Gemling Legionnaire and Invoker are the worst, right? So not because they're bad ascendancies, but because they take up like, 24 plus 19, nearly 44 to 45% of the player base are playing these two ascendancies currently in the standard or the current iteration of the early access, right? And like, void of the ones that say like Leap Slam or whatnot, every other build, if I click on them, they will have Hands of Wisdom, right? So this one here, guess what? Hands of Wisdom, Pillar of the Cage God. If we go back to Gemling Legionnaire, right down the bottom, 100% guarantee Hands of Wisdom, Pillar of the Cage God. Same deal. And at Series Disdain is used quite frequently as well. And Astramentus and Moria Invictus and Ingenuity. Now, obviously, like, this always exists with the upper echelon builds, but like, this is not necessarily a good outcome because it means that there's just not that much diversity. And if you were to pull these like 5.2 mil DPS Tempest Flurry, right? 100% guaranteed to have Hands of Wisdom. Again, if you were to pull this out and actually pull that Hand of Wisdom off the build, the DPS will go from the 5 point whatever million DPS and it'll go down to a few 100,000, if even that. So that's currently one of the biggest issues with how build diversity works, is it's diverse as long as you run Hands of Wisdom essentially in every single melee build. If we go back and we have a look at like the problem here is like Titans, like 1.4% of players that are sort of checked on as the coming through and feeding in here are running the Titan. Now these tend to be a little more varied because the skills are just sort of all over the place, and I can't really get a gauge of like DPS on here because it's not very good. But yeah, like people are playing like some off meta stuff and stuff like that. It's very fringe sort of stuff in here. But again, like Ingenuity, totally overused item. Mortar Invictus, again, used way more than what you'd expect it to be used. Like 51% of the builds in here are using it. That means that there are just items that just far exceed the capability of rare items. And that's normal for like, trade league stuff, like people end up with mage bloods and stuff like that. But like the biggest issue I see with melee, unless you're playing like a configuration that uses Hands of Wisdom, then essentially your melee build's going to be relatively bad. And that's something where the skills, the lesser performing skills need to be propped up a bit, and also they need to make melee combat just overall a little bit better. There are some good things here, like Infernalist tends to be quite commonly used in the hardcore SSF space. But again, so do Invoker, and so do Stormweaver and Gemling Legionnaire. So like, we're using like ES stacking again, like, minion builds in particular, and Detonate Dead and whatnot tend to be the go-tos here. So like the Arsonist builds again, because they barely die. And the same deal with anything in hardcore as well. So like 14,000 ES, and again, ES stacking becomes like one of the big things here. Hardcore SSF, like Ice Strike, we've got lower DPSs because Hands of Wisdom's harder to come by. But yeah, so no Hands of Wisdom, the DPS just goes way down. 140k 140k DPS on this setup also means they're probably running very low tier maps as well because it's hardcore. So they're not able to farm upper level content too, which means that the skills don't scale up very well like they do. They did manage to farm some breach stuff from what I can see here. But yeah, anyway, overall, like just looking at this at face value on, the spread of the ascendancies and whatnot, like this isn't necessarily uncommon, but considering Path of Exile 2 and the nature of the game being different from Path of Exile 1, coming back full circle here, I just wouldn't have expected basically almost every build in Gemling Legionnaire and Invoker is running Hands of Wisdom, and then everything in Stormweaver is running like Ingenuity, and then basically, yeah, it's just the same Archmage setup or configuration or a variation of that build. So that's where it's sort of problematic. This will improve over time as well, because obviously we're void of a whole heap of ascendancies. Like we got less than a third of the ascendancies in the game currently. So this will change drastically. I just hope that this actually does change and it doesn't end up like attribute stacking, hands of wisdom, and mana stacking and ES stacking is just the continued norm. Like I want to see that change over time. But for right now, this is something that as they add more content in, this will improve. But it's also something they need to be very well aware of so that these lock stock standard metas don't continue to be the same meta every single patch that they release. There needs to be enough variation in the builds that I actually would prefer to see a much more equalized spread here, like, 20%, 15%, 10%, and then variations of all the other builds. But, and that's if all the classes are balanced a lot more than what they were, for example, in Path of Exile 1. But anyway, like, it is interesting to look at these metrics. I'll put a link to in the description for this. Also, when doing league start sort of setups and things like that, this is great reference material, just as an FYI, because you can learn from how the builds are put together and put together something really cool. So yeah, we'll probably look at doing some league start or some patch start videos and leveling up some starter guides and stuff like that as well in the lead up to the point 2 patch release later in the month. Okay, so hopefully this video sort of touched on some points that would be really good changes to be added into the game and adjusted and things like that. If you agree, feel free to, drop a comment below and, just keep the comments clean and be respectful to one another. I did notice that over the last, like, quarter of a year or whatnot, since Path of Exile 2's been out, there's been a bit of a diversive community backlash sort of thing that's appeared, and I don't want that coming anywhere near my channel. So, be respectful to one another and whatnot down there. But anyway, if this video sort of touched on a few of the points that you sort of look at the game and go, these are actually genuine improvements that could be made, and hopefully they do come in the patch, feel free to like, and don't forget to sub to the channel. I'll be coming out with a lot more videos moving forwards. We'll be covering off on some Last Epoch stuff and also some Freshia stuff a little bit later today. And anyway, I will see you guys later on. Have a good one, and yeah, enjoy your weekend.